The North American Aviation P-51 Mustang was an American long-range, single-seat fighter and fighter bomber used during World War II, the Korean War and other conflicts. The Mustang was conceived, designed and built by North American Aviation in response to a specification issued directly to NAA by the British Purchasing Commission. The prototype NA-73X airframe was rolled out on September 9, 1940, 102 days after the contract was signed and, with an engine installed, first flew on October 26. The Mustang was originally designed to use the Allison V1710 engine, which had limited high-altitude performance. It was first flown operationally by the Royal Air Force as a tactical reconnaissance aircraft and fighter bomber. The addition of the Rolls-Royce Merlin to the P-51 bytes per carat model transformed the Mustang's performance at altitudes above 15,000 ft, matching or bettering that of the Luftwaffe's fighters. The definitive version, the P-51D, was powered by the Packard V1650-7, a license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 60 Series two-stage two-speed supercharged engine, and armed with 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. From late 1943, P-51Bs were used by the USAAF's 8th Air Force to escort bombers in raids over Germany, while the RAF's 2TAF and the USAAF's 9th Air Force used the Merlin-powered Mustangs as fighter bombers, roles in which the Mustang helped ensure Allied air superiority in 1944. The P-51 was also in service with Allied air forces in the North African, Mediterranean and Italian theaters, and saw limited service against the Japanese in the Pacific War. During World War II, Mustang pilots claimed 4,950 enemy aircraft shot down. At the start of the Korean War, the Mustang was the main fighter of the United Nations until jet fighters such as the F-86 took over this role. The Mustang then became a specialized fighter bomber. Despite the advent of jet fighters, the Mustang remained in service with some air forces until the early 1980s. After World War II and the Korean War, many Mustangs were converted for civilian use, especially air racing, and increasingly, preserved and flown as historic warbird aircraft at air shows. Design and development, Genesis. In April 1938, shortly after the German Anschluss of Austria, the British government established a purchasing commission in the United States, headed by Sir Henry Self. Self was given overall responsibility for Royal Air Force production and research and development, and also served with Sir Wilfrid Freeman, the Air Member for Development and Production. Self also sat on the British Air Council Subcommittee on Supply, and one of his tasks was to organise the manufacturing and supply of American fighter aircraft for the RAF. At the time, the choice was very limited, as no U.S. aircraft then in production or flying met European standards, with only the Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk coming close. The Curtiss-Wright plant was running at capacity, so P-40s were in short supply. North American Aviation was already supplying its Harvard trainer to the RAF, but was otherwise underutilized. NAA President Dutch Kindelberger approached Self to sell a new medium bomber, the B-25 Mitchell. Instead, Self asked if NAA could manufacture the Tomahawk under license from Curtiss. Kindelberger said NAA could have a better aircraft with the same engine in the air sooner than establishing a production line for the P-40. The commission stipulated armament of 4.303 in machine guns, the Allison V1710 liquid-cooled engine, a unit cost of no more than $40,000, and delivery of the first production aircraft by January 1941. In March 1940, 320 aircraft were ordered by Sir Wilfrid Freeman, who had become the executive head of Ministry of Aircraft Production, and the contract was promulgated on April 24. The NA-73X, which was designed by a team led by lead engineer Edgar Schmude, followed the best conventional practice of the era, but included several new features. One was a wing designed using laminar flow airfoils, which were developed cooperatively by North American Aviation and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. These airfoils generated very low drag at high speeds. During the development of the NA-73X, a wind tunnel test of two wings, one using NACA 5-digit airfoils and the other using the new NACA 45 Euro 100 airfoils, was performed in the University of Washington Curson Wind Tunnel. The results of this test showed the superiority of the wing designed with the NACA 45 Euro 100 airfoils. The other feature was a new radiator design that exploited the Meredith effect, in which heated air exited the radiator as a slight amount of jet thrust. Because NAA lacked a suitable wind tunnel to test this feature, it used the Galsit 10 FT wind tunnel at Caltech. This led to some controversy over whether the Mustang's cooling system aerodynamics were developed by NAA's engineer Edgar Schmid or by Curtiss, although NAA had purchased the complete set of P-40 and XP-46 wind tunnel data and flight test reports for $56,000. The NA-73X was also one of the first aircraft to have a fuselage lofted mathematically using conic sections. This resulted in the aircraft's fuselage having smooth, low-drag surfaces. To aid production, the airframe was divided into 5 main sections: a Euro forward, center, rear fuselage and 2 wing halves, a Euro, all of which were fitted with wiring and piping before being joined. The prototype NA-73X was rolled out in September 1940 and first flew on October 26, 1940, respectively 102 and 149 days after the order had been placed, an uncommonly short gestation period. The prototype handled well and accommodated an impressive fuel load. The aircraft's 2-section, semi-monocoque fuselage was constructed entirely of aluminum to save weight. It was armed with 4.30 in M1919 Browning machine guns, 2 in the wings and 2 mounted under the engine and firing through the propeller arc using gun synchronizing gear. While the United States Army Air Corps could block any sales it considered detrimental to the interests of the U.S., the NA-73 was considered to be a special case because it had been designed at the behest of the British. In September 1940, a further 300 NA-73s were ordered by MAP. To ensure uninterrupted delivery, Colonel Oliver P. Eccles arranged with the Anglo-French Purchasing Commission to deliver the aircraft, and NAA gave 2 examples to the USAAC for evaluation. Operational history, U.S. operational service, pre-war theory. Pre-war doctrine was based on the idea the bomber will always get through. Despite RAF and Luftwaffe experience, the USAAC still believed in 1942 that tightly packed formations of bombers would have so much firepower that they could fend off fighters on their own. Fighter escort was low priority, and when an escort fighter was planned in 1941, not considering what the nascent NA-73 design could be developed into a Euro at a time when a heavy fighter with twin engines was considered to be most appropriate, like the Americans' own fast-flying Lockheed P-38 Lightning for existing types in the USAAF inventory, a Euro it would be a heavily up-armed gunship conversion of a strategic bomber that would get a chance to prove itself in action. Additionally, a high-speed fighter with the range of a bomber was thought to be an engineering impossibility. 8th Air Force Operations 1942 a Euro 1943, the 8th Air Force started operations from Britain in August 1942. At first, because of the limited scale of operations, there was no conclusive evidence American doctrine was failing. In the 26 operations flown to the end of 1942, the loss rate had been under 2%. This rate was better than the RAF's night efforts, and similar to the losses one would expect due to mechanical failure. In January 1943, at the Casablanca Conference, the Allies formulated the Combined Bomber Offensive Plan for round-the-clock bombing, a Euro USAAF daytime operations complementing the RAF nighttime raids on industrial centers. In June 1943, the Combined Chiefs of Staff issued a point-blank directive to destroy the Luftwaffe's capacity before the planned invasion of Europe, putting the CBO into full implementation. Following this, the 8th Air Force's heavy bombers conducted a series of deep penetration raids into Germany, beyond the range of escort fighters. German daytime fighter efforts were, at that time, focused on the Eastern Front and several other distant locations. Initial efforts by the 8th met limited and unorganized resistance, but with every mission the Luftwaffe moved more aircraft to the west and quickly improved their battle direction. The Schwerin 30 Euro Regensburg mission in August lost 60 B-17s of a force of 376, the 14th October attack lost 77 of a force of 291, a Euro 26% of the attacking force. Losses were so severe that long-range missions were called off. The outcome of these air battles were extensively studied by both forces. The Luftwaffe felt their primary problem was armament, as their fighters were designed for combat against other fighters and lacked a weapon suitable to quickly knocking down an aircraft as large as the B-17, preferably from beyond the effective range of the bomber formation's heavy defensive firepower. As almost every B-17 or B-24 aircraft in a typical USAAF combat box heavy bomber formation had, by 1944, at least a dozen Browning M2 light barrel .50 calorie guns aboard them for defensive firepower. An 18-plane box possessed a combined level of defensive firepower consisting of upwards of well over 200 Browning M2 machine guns, with dozens of them aimed in virtually every direction that a hostile fighter could approach it from. The Luftwaffe responded to this need by fostering the development of heavier, 30 caliber autocannons like the Mk108, and other weapons, as well as moving twin-engine heavy fighters to the bomber-destroyer role that could carry the 37 and 50 Balkan-owned series of heavy-caliber, auto-loading guns, as well as the BR-21 heavy-caliber unguided rockets that entered service in the spring of 1943. With these changes, along with better command and control needed to direct the large number of aircraft, their forces developed for a return of combat in the spring. For the U.S., the very concept of self-defending bombers was called into question. But instead of abandoning daylight raids and turning to night bombing, as the RAF suggested, they chose other paths. At first it was believed that the Boeing YB-40 would be able to escort the bomber formations, but, when the concept proved to be unsuccessful, thoughts then turned to the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. In early 1943 the USAAF also decided that the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51B be considered for the role of a smaller escort fighter and, in July a report stated that the P-51B was the most promising plane. With an endurance of 4 hours 45 minutes with the standard internal fuel of 184 gallons plus 150 gallons carried externally. In August a P-51B was fitted with an extra internal 85-gallon tank and, although there were problems with longitudinal stability and some compromises in performance with the tank full, it was decided that because the fuel from the fuselage tank would be used during the initial stages of a mission, the fuel tank would be fitted in all Mustangs destined for 8 Fighter Command. P-51 introduction. The P-51 Mustang was a solution to the clear need for an effective bomber escort. The Mustang was at least as simple as other aircraft of its era. It used a common, reliable engine and had internal space for a huge fuel load. With external fuel tanks, it could accompany the bombers all the way to Germany and back. Enough P-51s became available to the 8th and 9th Air Forces in the winter of 1943 to 1944. When the point-blank offensive resumed in early 1944, matters had changed dramatically. The defense was initially layered, using the shorter-range P-38s and P-47s to escort the bombers during the initial stages of the raid and then handing over to the P-51 when they turned for home. This provided continual coverage during the entire raid. The Mustang was so clearly superior to earlier U.S. designs that the 8th Air Force began to steadily switch its fighter groups to the Mustang, first exchanging arriving P-47 groups for those of the 9th Air Force using P-51s, then gradually converting its Thunderbolt and Lightning groups. By the end of 1944, 14 of its 15 groups flew the Mustang. The Luftwaffe's twin-engine heavy fighters brought up to deal with the bombers proved to be easy prey for the Mustangs and had to be quickly withdrawn from combat. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A, already suffering from poor high-altitude performance, was no match for the Mustang at the B-17's altitude, and when laden with heavy bomber hunting weapons as a replacement for the more vulnerable twin-engine Zesta paragraph rare heavy fighters, it suffered badly. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G was on a more even footing at high altitudes, but this lightweight platform was even more greatly affected by increases in armament. The Mustang's much lighter armament, tuned for anti-fighter combat, allowed them to hunt down both of these fighters with relative ease. The Luftwaffe initially adapted to the U.S. fighters by modifying their tactics. Instead of approaching in small groups in ad hoc formations, they instead formed up en masse in front of the bombers' line of approach, and then attacked by making a single pass through the formation. Flying in close formation with the bombers, the P-51s had little time to react before the attackers were already running out of range. Fighting the Luftwaffe. General James Doolittle told the fighters in early 1944 to stop flying in formation with the bombers and instead attack the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. The Mustang groups were sent in well before the bombers in a fighter sweep as a form of air supremacy action, intercepting German fighters while they were forming up. As a result, the Luftwaffe lost 17% of its fighter pilots in just over a week, and the Allies were able to establish air superiority. As Doolittle later noted, Adolf Galland said that the day we took our fighters off the bombers and put them against the German fighters, that is, went from defensive to offensive, Germany lost the air war. The Luftwaffe's answer was the Gefechtsverband. It consisted of a Sturmgruppe of heavily armed and armored FW-190s escorted by two Begleitgruppen of light fighters, often Bf-109gs, whose task was to keep the Mustangs away from the Sturmbparagraph paragraph CKEFW-190s attacking the bombers. This scheme was excellent in theory but difficult to apply in practice as the large German formation took a long time to assemble and was difficult to maneuver. It was often intercepted by the escorting P-51s using the newer fighter sweep tactics out ahead of the heavy bomber formations, breaking up the Gefechtsverband formations before reaching the bombers. When the Sturmgruppe was able to work as intended, the effects were devastating. With their engines and cockpits heavily armored, the FW-190 is attacked from astern, and gun camera films show that these attacks were often pressed to within 100 yards. While not always able to avoid contact with the escorts, the threat of mass attacks and later the company front assaults by armored Sturmgruppe FW-190s brought an urgency to attacking the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found, either in the air or on the ground. Beginning in late February 1944, 8th Air Force fighter units began systematic strafing attacks on German airfields with increasing frequency and intensity throughout the spring, with the objective of gaining air supremacy over the Normandy battlefield. In general, these were conducted by units returning from escort missions, but, beginning in March, many groups also were assigned airfield attacks instead of bomber support. The P-51, particularly with the advent of the K-14 gyro gun sight and the development of Clobber colleges for the training of fighter pilots in fall 1944, was a decisive element in Allied countermeasures against the Jagdwerber currency NDE. The numerical superiority of the USAAF fighters, superb flying characteristics of the P-51, and pilot proficiency helped cripple the Luftwaffe's fighter force. As a result, the fighter threat to U.S., and later British, bombers was greatly diminished by July 1944. The RAF, long proponents of night bombing for protection, were able to reopen daylight bombing in 1944 as a result of the destruction of the Luftwaffe. Reichsmarschall Hermann Gar Paragraph Ring, commander of the German Luftwaffe during the war, was quoted as saying, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." Mopping up. On April 15, 1944, 8FC began Operation Jackpot, attacks on Luftwaffe fighter airfields. As the efficacy of these missions increased, the number of fighters at the German airbases fell to the point where they were no longer useful targets. On May 21, targets were expanded to include railways, locomotives and rolling stock used by the Germans to transport material and troops, in missions dubbed Chattanooga. The P-51 excelled at this mission, although losses were much higher on strafing missions than in air-to-air combat, partially because, like other fighters using liquid-cooled engines, the Mustang's coolant system could be punctured by small arms, unlike the air-cooled double-wasp radials of its Republic P-47 Thunderbolt stablemates based in England, regularly tasked with ground strafing missions. Given the overwhelming Allied air superiority, the Luftwaffe put its effort into the development of aircraft of such high performance that they could operate with impunity. Foremost among these were the Messerschmitt Me-163 rocket interceptors and Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. In action, the Me-163 proved to be more dangerous to the Luftwaffe than to the Allies and was never a serious threat. The Me-262 was a serious threat, but attacks on their airfields neutralized them. The jet engines of the Me-262s needed careful nursing by their pilots, and these aircraft were particularly vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Lieutenant Chuck Yeager of the 357th Fighter Group was one of the first American pilots to shoot down a Me-262, which he caught during its landing approach. On October 7, 1944, Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 365th Fighter Group shot down two Me-262s that were taking off, while on the same day Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zienke, who had transferred to the Mustang-equipped 479th Fighter Group, shot down what he thought was a Bf-109, only to have his gun camera film reveal that it may have been a Me-262. The Mustang also proved useful against the V-1s launched toward London. P-51 BCS using 150-octane fuel were fast enough to catch the V-1 and operated in concert with shorter-range aircraft like advanced marks of the Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Tempest. By May 8, 1945, the 8th, 9th and 15th Air Force's P-51 groups claimed some 4,950 aircraft shot down and 4,131 destroyed on the ground. Losses were about 2,520 aircraft. The 8th Air Force's 4th Fighter Group was the top-scoring fighter group in Europe, with 1,016 enemy aircraft claimed destroyed. This included 550 claimed in aerial combat and 466 on the ground. In air combat, the top-scoring P-51 units were the 357th Fighter Group of the 8th Air Force with 565 air-to-air combat victories and the 9th Air Force's 354th Fighter Group with 664, which made it one of the top-scoring fighter groups. Martin Bowman reports that in the European theatre of operations, Mustangs flew 213,873 sorties and lost 2,520 aircraft to all causes. The top Mustang ace was the USAAF's George Priddy, whose final tally stood at 26 and a third, 23 of which were scored with the P-51, when he was shot down and killed by friendly fire on Christmas Day 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. In China and the Pacific Theater. In 1943, P-51B joined the American Volunteer Group. In early 1945, P-51C, D and K variants also joined the Chinese Nationalist Air Force. These Mustangs were provided to the 3rd, 4th and 5th Fighter Groups and used to attack Japanese targets in occupied areas of China. The P-51 became the most capable fighter in China while the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force used the Nakajima Ki-84 Hi-8 against it. The P-51 was a relative latecomer to the Pacific Theater. This was due largely to the need for the aircraft in Europe, although the P-38's twin-engine design was considered a safety advantage for long over-water flights. The first P-51s were deployed in the Far East later in 1944, operating in close support and escort missions, as well as tactical photo reconnaissance. As the war in Europe wound down, the P-51 became more common. Eventually, with the capture of Iwo Jima, it was able to be used as a bomber escort during Boeing B-29's Superfortress missions against the Japanese homeland. The P-51 was often mistaken for the Japanese Kawasaki Ki-61 Hen in both China and Pacific because of his similar appearance. Expert opinions. Chief Naval Test Pilot and CO captured enemy aircraft Flight Captain Eric Brown, CBE, DSC, AFC, RN, tested the Mustang at RA Farnborough in March 1944, and noted, "The Mustang was a good fighter and the best escort due to its incredible range, make no mistake about it. It was also the best American dogfighter." But the laminar flow wing fitted to the Mustang could be a little tricky. It could not by any means outturn a Spitfire, sick. No way. It had a good rate of roll, better than the Spitfire, so I would say the pluses to the Spitfire and the Mustang just about equate. If I were in a dogfight, I'd prefer to be flying the Spitfire. The problem was I wouldn't like to be in a dogfight near Berlin, because I could never get home to Britain in a Spitfire. The U.S. Air Force's Flight Test Engineering, assessed the Mustang B on April 24, 1944. The rate of climb is good and the high speed in level flight is exceptionally good at all altitudes, from sea level to 40,000 feet. The airplane is very maneuverable with good controllability at indicated speeds to 400 miles per hour. The stability about all axes is good and the rate of roll is excellent, however, the radius of turn is fairly large for a fighter. The cockpit layout is excellent, but visibility is poor on the ground and only fair in level flight. Kurt Bauer-Ligon, the third highest scoring German fighter pilot of World War II's Western Front, later stated, "We would outturn the P-51 and the other American fighters, with the Bf-109 or the FW-190. Their turn rate was about the same. The P-51 was faster than us but our munitions and cannon were better." Post-World War II. In the aftermath of World War II, the USAAF consolidated much of its wartime combat force and selected the P-51 as a standard piston-engine fighter, while other types, such as the P-38 and P-47, were withdrawn or given substantially reduced roles. As the more advanced jet fighters were introduced, the P-51 was also relegated to secondary duties. In 1947, the newly formed USAF Strategic Air Command employed Mustangs alongside F-6 Mustangs and F-82 Twin Mustangs, due to their range capabilities. In 1948, the designation P-51 was changed to F-51, and the existing F designator for photographic reconnaissance aircraft was dropped because of a new designation scheme throughout the USAF. Aircraft still in service in the USAF or Air National Guard when the system was changed included F-51B, F-51D, F-51K, RF-51D, RF-51K, and TRF-51D. They remained in service from 1946 through 1951. By 1950, although Mustangs continued in service with the USAF after the war, the majority of the USAF's Mustangs had become surplus to requirements and placed in storage, while some were transferred to the Air Force Reserve and the Air National Guard. From the start of the Korean War, the Mustang once again proved useful. A substantial number of stored or in-service F-51DS were shipped, via aircraft carriers, to the combat zone and were used by the USAF, and the Republic of Korea Air Force. The F-51 was used for ground attack, fitted with rockets and bombs, and photo reconnaissance, rather than being as interceptors or pure fighters. After the first North Korean invasion, USAF units were forced to fly from bases in Japan, and the F-51DS, with their long range and endurance, could attack targets in Korea that short-ranged F-80 jets could not. Because of the vulnerable liquid cooling system, however, the F-51s sustained heavy losses to ground fire. Because of its lighter structure, and a shortage of spare parts, the newer, faster F-51H was not used in Korea. Mustangs continued flying with USAF and ROKAF fighter-bomber units on close support and interdiction missions in Korea until 1953, when they were largely replaced as fighter-bombers by USAF F-84s, and by United States Navy Grumman F-9F Panthers. Other air forces and units using the Mustang included the Royal Australian Air Force's 77 Squadron, which flew Australian-built Mustangs as part of British Commonwealth Forces Korea. The Mustangs were replaced by Gloucester Meteor F-8s in 1951. The South African Air Force's 2 Squadron used US-built Mustangs as part of the US 18th Fighter Bomber Wing, and had suffered heavy losses by 1953, after which 2 Squadron converted to the F-86 Sabre. F-51s flew in the Air Force Reserve and Air National Guard throughout the 1950s. The last American USAF Mustang was F-51D-30 NAAF serial number 44-74936, which was finally withdrawn from service with the West Virginia Air National Guard in late 1956 and retired to what was then called the Air Force Central Museum, although it was briefly reactivated to fly at the 50th anniversary of the Air Force aerial firepower demonstration at the Air Proving Ground, Eglin AFB, Florida, on May 6, 1957. This aircraft, painted as P-51D-15NA serial number 44-15174, is on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, Wright-Patterson AFB, in Dayton, Ohio. The final withdrawal of the Mustang from USAF dumped hundreds of P-51s onto the civilian market. The rights to the Mustang design were purchased from North American by the Cavalier Aircraft Corporation, which attempted to market the surplus Mustang aircraft in the U.S. and overseas. In 1967 and again in 1972, the USAF procured batches of remanufactured Mustangs from Cavalier, most of them destined for air forces in South America and Asia that were participating in the Military Assistance Program. These aircraft were remanufactured from existing original F-51D airframes but were fitted with new V1650-7 engines, a new radio-fit, tall F-51H type vertical tails, and a stronger wing that could carry 6 0.50 in machine guns and a total of 8 underwing hardpoints. 2 1000 LB bombs and 6 5 in rockets could be carried. They all had an original F-51D type canopy, but carried a second seat for an observer behind the pilot. One additional Mustang was a two-seat dual-control TF-51D with an enlarged canopy and only 4 wing guns. Although these remanufactured Mustangs were intended for sale to South American and Asian nations through the MAP, they were delivered to the USAF with full USAF markings. They were, however, allocated new serial numbers. The last U.S. military use of the F-51 was in 1968, when the U.S. Army employed a vintage F-51D as a chase aircraft for the Lockheed YAL-56 Cheyenne armed helicopter project. This aircraft was so successful that the Army ordered 2 F-51Ds from Cavalier in 1968 for use at Fort Rucker as chase planes. They were assigned the serial 68 to 15795 and 68 to 15796. These F-51s had wingtip fuel tanks and were unarmed. Following the end of the Cheyenne program, these 2 chase aircraft were used for other projects. One of them was fitted with a 106-on recoilless rifle for evaluation of the weapon's value in attacking fortified ground targets. Cavalier Mustang 68 to 15796 survives at the Air Force Armament Museum, Eglin AFB, Florida, displayed indoors in World War II markings. The F-51 was adopted by many foreign air forces and continued to be an effective fighter into the mid-1980s with smaller air arms. The last Mustang ever downed in battle occurred during Operation Power Pack in the Dominican Republic in 1965, with the last aircraft finally being retired by the Dominican Air Force in 1984. Non-U.S. service: after World War II, the P-51 Mustang served in the air arms of more than 25 nations. During the war, a Mustang cost about $51,000, while many hundreds were sold post-war for the nominal price of $1 to signatories of the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, ratified in Rio de Janeiro in 1947. The following is a list of some of the countries that used the P-51 Mustang. Australia. In November 1944, 3 Squadron RAAF became the first Royal Australian Air Force unit to use Mustangs. At the time of its conversion from the P-40 to the Mustang, the squadron was based in Italy with the RAF's 1st Tactical Air Force. 3 Squadron was renumbered 4 Squadron after returning to Australia from Italy and converted to CAC-built Mustangs. Several other Australian or Pacific-based squadrons converted to P-51s from July 1945, having been equipped with P-40s or boomerangs for wartime service. These units were 76, 77, 82, 83, 84 and 86 squadrons. Only 17 Mustangs reached the RAAF's 1st Tactical Air Force frontline squadrons by the time World War II ended in August 1945. 76, 77 and 82 squadrons were formed into 81 Fighter Wing of the British Commonwealth Air Force, which was part of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force stationed in Japan from February 1946. 77 Squadron used its P-51s extensively during the first years of the Korean War, before converting to Gloster Meteor jets. 5 reserve units from the Citizen Air Force also operated Mustangs. 21 City of Melbourne Squadron, based in the state of Victoria. 22 City of Sydney Squadron, based in New South Wales. 23 City of Brisbane Squadron, based in Queensland. 24 City of Adelaide Squadron, based in South Australia. And 25 City of Perth Squadron, based in Western Australia. The last Mustangs were retired from these units in 1961. CAF units adopted a non-flying role. A Bolivia. 9 Cavalier F-51D were given to Bolivia, under a program called Peace Condor. A Canada. Canada had 5 squadrons equipped with Mustangs during World War II. Our CAF 400, 414 and 430 squadrons flew Mustang MKIs, and 441 and 442 squadrons flew Mustang MKIIs and IVAs in 1945. Post-war, a total of 150 Mustang P-51DS were purchased and served in 2 regular and 6 auxiliary fighter squadrons. The Mustangs were declared obsolete in 1956, but a number of special duty versions served on into the early 1960s. China. The Chinese Nationalist Air Force obtained the P-51 during the late Sino-Japanese War to fight against the Japanese. After the war, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government used the planes against insurgent communist forces. The nationalists retreated to Taiwan in 1949. Pilots supporting Chiang brought most of the Mustangs with them, where the aircraft became part of the island's defense arsenal. A People's Republic of China, the Communist Chinese captured 39 P-51s from the nationalists while they were retreating to Taiwan. Costa Rica, the Costa Rica Air Force flew 4 P-51DS from 1955 to 1964. Cuba, in November 1958. 3 U.S.-registered civilian P-51D Mustangs were illegally flown separately from Miami to Cuba, on delivery to the rebel forces of the 26th of July movement, then headed by Fidel Castro during the Cuban Revolution. One of the Mustangs was damaged during delivery, and none of them were used operationally. After the success of the revolution in January 1959, with other rebel aircraft plus those of the existing Cuban government forces, they were adopted into the FIREITSA or Copyright-Free Revolution area. Due to increasing U.S. restrictions, lack of spares and maintenance experience, they never achieved operational status. At the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion, the 2 intact Mustangs were already effectively grounded at Campo Colombia and at Santiago. After the failed invasion, they were placed on display with other symbols of revolutionary struggle, and one remains on display at the Museo del Aire. Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic was the largest Latin American air force to employ the P-51D, with 6 aircraft acquired in 1948, 44 ex-Swedish F-51DS purchased in 1948 and a further Mustang obtained from an unknown source. It was the last nation to have any Mustangs in service, with some remaining in use as late as 1984. 9 of the final 10 aircraft were sold back to American collectors in 1988. In El Salvador, the FAS purchased 5 Cavalier Mustang IIs that featured wingtip fuel tanks to increase combat range and uprated Merlin engines. 7 P-51D Mustangs were also in service. They were used during the 1969 soccer war against Honduras, the last time the P-51 was used in combat. One of them, FAS 404, was shot down by a F-4U-5 flown by Cap. Fernando Soto in the last aerial combat between piston engine fighters in the world. France. In late 1944, the first French unit began its transition to reconnaissance Mustangs. In January 1945, the Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron 233rd of the French Air Force took their F-6CS and F-6DS over Germany on photographic mapping missions. The Mustangs remained in service until the early 1950s, when they were replaced by jet fighters. In Germany, several P-51s were captured by the Luftwaffe as Butterflugzeuge following crash landings. These aircraft were subsequently repaired and test-flown by the Circus Rosarius, or Rosarius Staff, the official Erprobungskommando of the Luftwaffe High Command, for combat evaluation at Gar-Paragraph-Tingen. The aircraft were repainted with German markings and bright yellow nose and belly for identification. A number of P-51B P-51CS including examples marked with Luftwaffe Geschwaderknung codes T9 plus CK, T9 plus FK, T9 plus HK and T9 plus PK with a total of 3 captured P-51DS also flown by the unit. Some of these P-51s were found by Allied forces at the end of the war. Others crashed during testing. The Mustang is also listed in the appendix to the novel KG-200 as having been flown by the German Secret Operations Unit KG-200, which tested, evaluated and sometimes clandestinely operated captured enemy aircraft during World War II. Guatemala. The Fernitza or copyright Guatemalteca had 30 P-51D Mustangs in service from 1954 to the early 1970s. Haiti. Haiti had 4 P-51D Mustangs when President Paul Eugène Magla was in power from 1950 to 1956, with the last retired in 1973 €74 and sold for spares to the Dominican Republic. Indonesia. Indonesia acquired some P-51DS from the departing Netherlands East Indies Air Force in 1949 and 1950. The Mustangs were used against Commonwealth forces during the Indonesian confrontation in the early 1960s. The last time Mustangs were deployed for military purposes was a shipment of 6 Cavalier II Mustangs delivered to Indonesia in 1972–1973, which were replaced in 1976. Israel. A few P-51 Mustangs were illegally bought by Israel in 1948, created and smuggled into the country as agricultural equipment for use in the War of Independence and quickly established themselves as the best fighter in the Israeli inventory. Further aircraft were bought from Sweden, and were replaced by jets at the end of the 1950s, but not before the type was used in the Suez Crisis, Operation Kadesh. Reputedly, during this conflict, one Israeli pilot literally cut communications between Suez City and the Egyptian front lines by using his Mustang's propeller on the telephone wires. Italy was a post-war operator of P-51DS. Deliveries were slowed by the Korean War, but between September 1947 and January 1951, by MDAP count, 173 examples were delivered. They were used in all the AMI fighter units, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 51 Stormo, and some in schools and experimental units. Considered a glamorous fighter, P-51s were even used as personal aircraft by several Italian commanders. Some restrictions were placed on its use due to unfavorable flying characteristics. Handling had to be done with much care when fuel tanks were fully utilized and several aerobatic maneuvers were forbidden. Overall, the P-51D was highly rated even compared to the other primary post-war fighter in Italian service, the Supermarine Spitfire, partly because these P-51DS were in very good condition in contrast to all other Allied fighters supplied to Italy. Phasing out of the Mustang began in summer 1958. At Japan, the P-51C-11NT Evelina, marked as 278, and flown by 26th FS, 51st FG, was hit by gunfire on January 16, 1945 and belly-landed on Sukn Airfield in China, which was held by the Japanese. The Japanese repaired the aircraft, roughly applied Inomura roundels and flew the aircraft to the Fossa Evaluation Center in Japan. Netherlands. The Royal Netherlands East Indies Army Air Force received 40 P-51DS and flew them during the Indonesian National Revolution, particularly the two Polisional Acties Opera Thai product in 1947 and Opera Thai Krari in 1949. When the conflict was over, Indonesia received some of the MLK-NIL Mustangs. Nicaragua. Fernitza Aérea de Nicaragua purchased 26 P-51D Mustangs from Sweden in 1954 and later received 30 P-51D Mustangs from the U.S. together with 2 TF-51 models from MAP after 1954. All aircraft of this type were retired from service by 1964. New Zealand ordered 370 P-51 Mustangs to supplement its bought F-4 UCASs in the Pacific Ocean Areas Theater. Scheduled deliveries were for an initial batch of 30 P-51DS, followed by 137 more P-51DS and 203 P-51 milliseconds. The original 30 were being shipped as the war ended in August 1945. These were stored in their packing cases and the order for the additional Mustangs was cancelled. In 1951 the stored Mustangs entered service in 1, 2, Wellington, 3 and 4 squadrons of the Territorial Air Force. The Mustangs remained in service until they were prematurely retired in August 1955 following a series of problems with undercarriage and coolant system corrosion problems. 4 Mustangs served on as target tugs until the TAF was disbanded in 1957. RNZAF pilots in the Royal Air Force also flew the P-51, and at least one New Zealand pilot scored victories over Europe while on loan to a USAAF P-51 squadron. Philippines. The Philippines acquired 103 P-51D Mustangs after World War II. These became the backbone of the post-war Philippine Army Air Corps and Philippine Air Force and were used extensively during the Hue campaign, fighting against communist insurgents. Mustangs were also the first aircraft of the Philippine Air Demonstration Squadron, which was formed in 1953 and given the name the Blue Diamonds the following year. The Mustangs were replaced by 56 F-86 Sabres in the late 1950s, but some were still in service for coin rolls up to the early 1980s. Poland. During World War II, 5 Polish Air Force and Great Britain squadrons used Mustangs. The first Polish unit equipped with Mustang MKs was B Flight of 309 Zaimierzchewski SKIEJ Squadron, followed by A Flight in March 1943. Subsequently, 309 Squadron was redesignated a fighter reconnaissance unit and became part of Fighter Command. On March 13, 1944, 316 Warsawski Squadron received their first Mustang MKIIs. Rearming of the unit was completed by the end of April. By March 26, 1943, 306 Torowski SQN and 315 DAM registered trademark Bliowski SQN received Mustangs MKIIs. On October 20, 1944, Mustang MKs in No. 309 Squadron were replaced by MKIIs. On December 11, 1944, the unit was again renamed, becoming 309 Dywazon Mialski Zaimierzchewski SKIEJ, or 309 Land of Zerwin Polish Fighter Squadron. In 1945, 303 Kumorsko SQN received 20 Mustangs Mk4 MKIVA replacements. Post-war, between December 6, 1946 and January 6, 1947, all 5 Polish squadrons equipped with Mustangs were disbanded. Poland returned approximately 80 Mustangs MKIIs and 20 Mustangs Mk4IVAs to the RAF, which transferred them to the U.S. government. Somalia, the Somalian Air Force operated 8 P-51DS in post-World War II service. South Africa. No. 5 Squadron South African Air Force operated a number of Mustang MKIIs and MKIVs in Italy during World War II. Beginning in September 1944 when the squadron converted to the Mustang Mk3 from Kitty Hawks. The Mk4 and MKIVA came into SA service in March 1945. These aircraft were generally camouflaged in the British style, having been drawn from RAF stocks. All carried RAF serial numbers and were struck off charge and scrapped in October 1945. In 1950, 2 Squadron SAAF was supplied with F-51D Mustangs by the United States for Korean War service. The type performed well in South African hands before being replaced by the F-86 Sabre in 1952 and 1953. South Korea. Within a month of the outbreak of the Korean War, 10 F-51D Mustangs were provided to the badly depleted Republic of Korea Air Force as a part of the BAT-1 project. They were flown by both South Korean airmen, several of whom were veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy Air Services during World War II, as well as by U.S. advisors led by Major Dean Hess. Later, more were provided both from U.S. and from South African stocks, as the latter were converting to F-86 Sabres. They formed the backbone of the South Korean Air Force until they were replaced by Sabres. It also served with the ROKAF Black Eagles aerobatic team, until retired 1954. Sweden. Sweden's Flygvapnet first recuperated 4 of the P-51s that had been diverted to Sweden during missions over Europe. In February 1945, Sweden purchased 50 P-51DS designated J-26, which were delivered by American pilots in April and assigned to the F-16 wing at Uppsala as interceptors. In early 1946, the F-4 wing at Östersund was equipped with a second batch of 90 P-51DS. A final batch of 21 Mustangs was purchased in 1948. In all, 161 J-26s served in the Swedish Air Force during the late 1940s. About 12 were modified for photo reconnaissance and redesignated S-26. Some of these aircraft participated in the secret Swedish mapping of new Soviet military installations at the Baltic coast in 1946, a Euro-47, an endeavor that entailed many intentional violations of Soviet airspace. However, the Mustang could outdive any Soviet fighter of that era, so no S-26s were lost in these missions. The J-26s were replaced by de Havilland Vampires around 1950. The S-26s were replaced by S-29CS in the early 1950s. Switzerland. The Swiss Air Force operated a few USAAF P-51s that had been impounded by Swiss authorities during World War II after the pilots were forced to land in neutral Switzerland. After the war, Switzerland also bought 130 P-51s for $4,000 each. They served until 1958. The United Kingdom, the RAF was the first air force to operate the Mustang. As the first Mustangs were built to British requirements, these aircraft used factory numbers and were not P-51s. The order comprised 320 NA-73s, followed by 300 NA-83s, all of which were designated North American Mustang Mark I by the RAF. The first RAF Mustangs diverted from American orders were 93 P-51s, designated Mark IA, followed by 50 P-51s used as Mustang IIs. The first Mustang Mk entered service in 1941, the first unit being 2 Squadron RAF. Due to poor high-altitude performance, the Mustangs were used by Army Cooperation Command, rather than Fighter Command, and were used for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack duties. On July 27, 1942, 16 RAF Mustangs undertook their first long-range reconnaissance mission over Germany. During the deep raid, 4 British and Canadian Mustang squadrons, including 26 squadrons, saw action. By 1943 1944, British Mustangs were used extensively to seek out V-1 flying bomb sites. The final RAF Mustang Mki and Mustang Mk2 aircraft was struck off charge in 1945. The RAF also operated 308 P-51BS and 636 P-51CS, which were known in RAF service as Mustang Mkiis. The first units converted to the type in late 1943 and early 1944. Mustang Mk3 units were operational until the end of World War II, though many units had already converted to the Mustang Mk4 and Mki-VAs. As the Mustang was a Lend-Lease type, all aircraft still on RAF charge at the end of the war were either returned to the USAAF on paper, or retained by the RAF for scrapping. The final Mustangs were retired from RAF use in 1947. Soviet Union. The Soviet Union received at least 10 early Model X RAF Mustangs and tested but found them to underperform compared to contemporary USSR fighters, relegating them to training units. Later Lend-Lease deliveries of the P-51 bytes per Carat and D series, along with other Mustangs abandoned in Russia after the famous shuttle missions, were repaired and used by the Soviet Air Force but not in frontline service. Uruguay. The Uruguayan Air Force used 25 P-51D Mustangs from 1950 to 1960. Some were subsequently sold to Bolivia, P-51s and civil aviation. Many P-51s were sold as surplus after the war, often for as little as $1,500. Some were sold to former wartime flyers or other aficionados for personal use, while others were modified for air racing. One of the most significant Mustangs involved in air racing was a surplus P-51 C-10NT purchased by film stunt pilot Paul Mantz. The aircraft was modified by creating a wet wing, sealing the wing to create a giant fuel tank in each wing, which eliminated the need for fuel stops or drag-inducing drop tanks. This Mustang, called Blaze of Noon, came in first in the 1946 and 1947 Bendix Air Races, second in the 1948 Bendix, and third in the 1949 Bendix. He also set a U.S. coast-to-coast record in 1947. The Mantz Mustang was sold to Charles F. Blair Jr. and renamed Excalibur III. Blair used it to set a New York to London record in 1951, 7h48 minutes from takeoff at Idlewild to overhead London Airport. Later that same year, he flew from Norway to Fairbanks, Alaska, via the North Pole, proving that navigation via sun sites was possible over the magnetic North Pole region. For this feat, he was awarded the Harmon Trophy, and the Air Force was forced to change its thoughts on a possible Soviet airstrike from the north. This Mustang now resides in the National Air and Space Museum at the Stephen F. Vorhazy Center. The most prominent firm to convert Mustangs to civilian use was Trans-Florida Aviation, later renamed Cavalier Aircraft Corporation, which produced the Cavalier Mustang. Modifications included a taller tailfin and wing-tip tanks. A number of conversions included a Cavalier Mustang Specialty, a tight second seat added in the space formerly occupied by the military radio and fuselage fuel tank. In 1958, 78 surviving RCAF Mustangs were retired from service's inventory and were ferried by Lynn Garrison, an RCAF pilot, from their varied storage locations to Canastota, New York, where the American buyers were based. In effect, Garrison flew each of the surviving aircraft at least once. These aircraft make up a large percentage of the aircraft presently flying worldwide. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the United States Department of Defense wished to supply aircraft to South American countries and later Indonesia for close air support and counterinsurgency, it turned to Cavalier to return some of their civilian conversions back to updated military specifications. In the 21st century, a P-51 can command a price of more than $1 a million, even for only partially restored aircraft. There were 204 privately owned P-51s in the U.S. on the FAA registry in 2011. Most of which are still flying, often associated with organizations such as the Commemorative Air Force. Incidents: on June 9, 1973, William Penn-Patrick, a certified pilot, and his passenger, Christian Hagert, died when Patrick's privately owned P-51 Mustang crashed in Lakeport, California. On September 16, 2011, the Galloping Ghost, a modified P-51 piloted by Jimmy Leeward of Ocala, Florida, crashed during an air race in Reno, Nevada. Leeward and at least 9 people on the ground were killed when the racer suddenly crashed near the edge of the grandstand. On October 23, 2013, Galveston Gal, P-51D number 44 to 73458 N4151D, piloted by 51-year-old pilot Keith Hibbert of Denton, accompanied by his 66-year-old passenger John Stephen Busby, who was visiting from the United Kingdom, were killed when the aircraft crashed in about 4 feet of water off the coast of Galveston, Texas. Busby was celebrating his 41st wedding anniversary. Variants. Production. Source: U.S. Military aircraft designations and serial since 1909, NA-73X, prototype, 1 built, A-36 Apache/A-36 Invader, 500 built as an attack variant of the initial production run for the UK, initially named Invader but very quickly renamed Apache, P-51, 150 built, P-51A, 1500 built at Inglewood, California. Last Allison engine version built. P-51B, 1988 built at Inglewood. First production version to be equipped with the Merlin engine. P-51C, 1750 built at Dallas, Texas. P-51C, field modification to create dual control variant. at least 5 known built during World War II for training and VIP transport. P-51D, a total of 8,156 were built, 6,502 at Inglewood, 1,454 at Dallas and 200 by CAC at Fisherman's Bend, Melbourne, Australia. XP-51F, 3 built, XP-51G, 2 built, P-51H, 555 built at Inglewood, XP-51J, 2 built, P-51K, 1,500 built, P-51L, none built at Euro. Cancelled, P-51M, 1 built at Dallas, Mustang MKI, 620 built, Mustang MK. 852 built, Mustang MKIV, 281 built, Mustang MKIVA, 595 built, Rolls-Royce Mustang MKX. 5 prototype conversions. Only a Euro 2 Mustang MKI airframes were initially trial-fitted with Rolls-Royce Merlin 65 engines in mid-late 1942, in order to test the performance of the aircraft with a power plant better adapted to medium-high altitudes. The successful conversion of the Packard V1650 Merlin-powered NAAP 51 bytes per carat equivalent rendered this experiment as superfluous. Although the conversions were highly successful, the planned production of 500 examples was cancelled. Commonwealth CA-17 Mustang Mk20, 80 Australian assembled P-51DS. Commonwealth CA-18 Mustang Mk21, Mk22 and Mk23, license production of 120 of the P-51D model, of which the Mk21 and Mk22 used the American-built Packard V1650-3 or V1650-7, and the Mk23, which followed the Mk21, was powered by Rolls-Royce Merlin 66 or Merlin 70 engines. 170 were ordered but only 120 were built. Total number built, 16,766, survivors. Specifications. Data from Erection and Maintenance Manual for P-51D and P-51K. The Great Book of Fighters, and Quest for Performance, General Characteristics, Crew, 1, Length, 32 ft3 in, Wingspan, 37 ft0 in, Height, 13 ft4 or 1/2 in, Wing Area, 235 square foot, Empty weight, 7,635 lb, Loaded weight, 9,200 lb, Max takeoff weight, 12,100 lb, Power plant, 1 Packard V1650-7 liquid-cooled supercharged V12, 1,490 HP at 3,000 RPMs. 1,720 HP at WEP, 0 lift drag coefficient, 0.0163, drag area, 3.80 SQFT, aspect ratio, 5.83, performance, maximum speed, 437 mph at 25,000 ft, cruise speed, 362 mph, stall speed, 100 mph, range, 1,650 mi with external tanks, service ceiling, 41,900 ft, rate of climb, 3,200 a foot per minute, wing. Loading, 39 lb SQFT, power mass, 0.18 horsepower per pound, lift-to-drag ratio, 14.6, recommended Mach limit 0.8, armament, 6A, 0.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns with 1,880 total rounds, 2A, hardpoints for up to 2,000 pounds of bombs, 6 or 10A, T-64 5.0 in HVAR rockets, notable appearances in media. Battle Hymn is based on the real-life experiences of Lieutenant Colonel Dean E. Hess, USAF, and his cadre of U.S. Air Force instructors in the early days of the Korean War, training the pilots of the Republic of Korea Air Force and leading them during their first missions in F-51D F-51KS. Goodbye, Mickey Mouse is a historical novel by Len Dayton. Set in Britain in early 1944, it tells the story of the 220th Fighter Group of the U.S. 8th Air Force flying P-51s in the lead-up to the Allied invasion of Europe. The group is based at the fictional Steeple Thaxted Airfield in Norfolk. The Tuskegee Airmen, the story of how a group of African-American pilots overcame racist opposition to become one of the finest U.S. fighter groups in World War II, flying P-51s, although the 99th Squadron would have used P-40s and P-39s during their North African stint. Red Tail Reborn, the story behind the restoration of a flying memorial aircraft. Red Tails is a George Lucas-produced film about the Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd Fighter Group, featuring P-51 Mustangs in their role as escort fighters. Scale replicas. As indicative of the iconic nature of the P-51, the aircraft has been the subject of numerous scale flying replicas. Aside from ever-popular SC-controlled aircraft, several kit plane manufacturers offer a 1/2, A, and a 3/4 scale replicas capable of comfortably seating one and offering high performance combined with more forgiving flight characteristics. Such aircraft include the Titan T-51 Mustang, WAR P-51 Mustang, Lin Mini Mustang, Jerkin Thunder Mustang, and Lu A-51-51 Mustang. Multiple manufacturers within the hobby industry have created scale plastic model kits of the P-51 Mustang. These kits range from beginner to advanced skill levels, with various degrees of detail in each kit. See also: Related development, Cavalier Mustang, North American F-36, Rolls-Royce Mustang MKX, North American F-82 Twin Mustang, North American FJ-1 Fury, Piper PA-48 Enforcer, Stewart S-51D Mustang home-built scale replica, aircraft of comparable role, configuration and era, CAC CA-15 Kangaroo, Focke-Wulf FW-190D, Focke-Wulf TAR-152, Lavochkin La-9, Martin Baker MB-5, Messerschmitt Bf-109, Supermarine Spitfire, Yakovlev Yak-9. Related lists: List of aircraft of World War II, List of military aircraft of the United States, List of aircraft of the United Kingdom in World War II, List of fighter aircraft, Allied technological cooperation during World War II, References, Notes. Citations. Bibliography. External links: A Fighter from the Ground Up. Popular Science, July 1943, one of earliest detailed articles on P-51A, Wild Horses of the Sky, Popular Mechanics, November 1943, Joe Boer, North American P-51 Mustang, Camouflage and Markings of P-51 Mustang Parts 1 Euro 4 USA AF plus Allison engine versions are AF and Commonwealth, P-51 Warbird Registry, Names, Serial Numbers, Images, Allison-powered Mustang Performance Test Reports. 1940, 1942, 1943, 1944, P-51B Mustang Performance Test Report, May 1943, P-51 Combat Reports, NACAWRL 566 Flying Qualities and Stalling Characteristics of North American XP-51 Airplane, April 1943. North American P-51 Profile, Photos and Technical Details for each Mk, Flight Characteristics of the North American P-51 Mustang, How to Fly the P-51 Mustang on YouTube, Mustang Squadron a 1942 flight article, Army Co-op Mustang a 1942 flight article, Unobtrusive Cleverness a 1942 flight article, Long Range Mustang a 1944 flight article.